She had spent 2 years searching his face for one moment of recognition, and the night she finally stopped looking, he felt the loss like a blade he hadn't known was turning. At the winter ball inside Hartwell Manor, Edmund Fairchild, the Duke of Hartwell, walked into his own grand drawing room and found his wife standing among their guests, and for the first time in 2 years, she did not look up. She did not wait. She did not watch for him. And somehow that small silence was the loudest thing he had ever heard. If you have ever loved someone who never truly saw you, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel, because this story belongs to every woman who finally chose herself. The winter of 1886 arrived early in Gloucestershire. By the second week of December, frost had settled across the fields surrounding Hartwell Manor, hardening the soil and silencing the birds that had called from the old oaks all through autumn. The estate itself stood as it always had, massive, assured, indifferent to seasons. Its stone face caught the pale morning light without warmth, and its windows reflected the sky back at the world, like eyes that had learned long ago not to reveal what lay behind them. Edmund Fairchild had grown up inside those walls. He understood their nature because in many ways he shared it. The Duke of Hartwell was 38 years old and had spent every one of those years learning how to hold things together through sheer force of will. His father had left the estate in debt and left Edmund at 22 to sort it out. He had sorted it out. He had rebuilt the Fairchild fortunes through careful investments, shrewd alliances, and the kind of disciplined focus that left very little room for softness. He was not cruel. He had never been cruel. But he had spent so long treating sentiment as a luxury he could not afford that he had forgotten somewhere along the way that the people around him were not simply instruments of stability. Victoria had come into his life 2 years ago under the logic of mutual benefit. The Ashford family of Kent carried political influence that the Fairchild name, powerful as it was, lacked in certain circles. The Fairchilds offered financial security and social prestige that the Ashfords, despite their old blood, were beginning to strain to maintain. It was, by the standards of their world, an excellent arrangement. Both families agreed. Both sets of solicitors agreed. And Edmund himself had looked at Victoria Ashford across a dinner table in London and thought, with the detached assessment of a man evaluating a promising contract, that she would do very well. He had not been wrong exactly. She had done more than well. She had exceeded every expectation he had not bothered to articulate, and he had accepted her competence the way a man accepts the reliability of a well-made clock, with the vague satisfaction of someone who has chosen correctly and not much else. Victoria was 29. She had large gray eyes that caught light the way still water does, unexpectedly, suddenly, in a way that startled you if you were paying attention. She was not the kind of woman who announced herself in a room. She moved quietly, spoke precisely, and possessed the particular intelligence of someone who had learned very early that the world would not reward her for showing everything she knew. She had come into the marriage with her family's political connections and her own considerable social skill, and she had deployed both in service of Hartwell without being asked and without being thanked. For 2 years, Victoria Fairchild had watched her husband the way a woman watches a door she hopes will open. She had arranged his household with the precision of someone who understood that a duke's domestic life was also his political life, and that the two could not be separated. She had learned the names of every tenant on the Hartwell land, not just their surnames, but their children's names, their particular difficulties. The specific grievances that left unaddressed became the kind of slow-burning resentments that destroyed estates from the inside. She had cultivated friendships with the neighboring gentry that Edmund found useful without understanding quite how they had been built. She had hosted dinners and managed correspondence and navigated the dense, suffocating social architecture of the Victorian aristocracy with a grace that made it look effortless. And every single time Edmund walked into a room, she had looked up. It was such a small thing. She had not even been aware of it for most of the first year. It had simply happened, a reflex, an instinct, the body's honest expression of what the heart was still hoping for. She would be in conversation, or reading, or managing some household matter, and the moment she heard his step in the corridor, something in her would shift. She would turn. She would look, not because she needed instruction, not because she was waiting for orders, but because some stubborn, quiet part of her had not yet stopped believing that one day he would walk into a room and look back. He never did. Not really. Not the way she meant. Edmund noticed her, the way a man notices furniture that has been well chosen appreciatively briefly, without depth. He would nod. Sometimes he would say something polite, and then he would move to the matter he had actually come for, and Victoria would turn back to whatever she had been doing, and the door would close a little further each time. By the end of the first year, she had learned to stop asking, not about the large things, those she simply handled without consultation, because consultation required a response and responses from Edmund were infrequent and usually brief. But the small things, the hopeful things, the things a wife asks a husband not because she needs the answer, but because she wants the conversation. She had stopped asking those. By the middle of the second year, she had stopped explaining herself, and somewhere in the weeks before December, Victoria Fairchild had stopped looking up. She had not planned it. It was not a decision made in anger, not a strategy assembled in a quiet room with a clear objective. It was simply the final inevitable result of hope used up. A woman could turn toward a closed door for only so long before her body in its quiet wisdom simply stopped turning. The winter ball at Hartwell Manor was held on the 14th of December. It was an annual tradition, one of the estate's most significant social events of the year, attended by the neighboring aristocracy. Several members of Parliament, whose relationships Edmund cultivated with careful attention, and the kind of old money families whose presence at a gathering confirmed that the gathering mattered. Victoria had organized every detail over the course of 3 weeks. The flowers, the menu, the seating arrangement, each decision made with the specific social calculus of a woman who understood that these evenings were never simply evenings. By the time the guests arrived, Hartwell Manor blazed with candlelight. The long drawing room warm with conversation, and the kind of orchestrated elegance that looked spontaneous only to people who have never had to produce it. Victoria moved through the room in a gown of deep blue silk that she had selected herself without once wondering whether Edmund would like it, a small revolution that she had not yet named. Edmund arrived late. This was not unusual. He had been in meetings with his solicitor all day regarding a complicated question involving 2 parcels of tenant land on the estate's eastern boundary, a dispute that had been brewing for months and that he had been intending to address since September without quite getting to it. By the time he dressed and came downstairs, the drawing room was already full, and the sound of conversation and the clink of crystal carried into the corridor before he opened the door. He stepped inside. He moved through the room with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with the authority his presence carried. Guests turned. A few nodded. Lord Ashcroft from the neighboring estate lifted his glass. Edmund acknowledged all of it with the measured grace of someone who had spent his entire life being the most important person in the room and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. And then he looked for his wife. It took him a moment to find her. She was standing near the far windows in conversation with Lady Pembroke and a woman Edmund vaguely recognized as the wife of a barrister from Cheltenham. Victoria was speaking, saying something that made Lady Pembroke laugh, a genuine laugh, the kind that makes a woman touch her own throat in surprised delight. Victoria's profile was turned 3/4 away from the door. She was animated, present, entirely absorbed in the conversation she was having. She did not look up. Edmund paused. It was such a small thing. He would not have been able to explain if asked exactly what it was that registered in that moment. He had not spent 2 years consciously aware that his wife watched for him when he entered rooms. But he had been aware of it somewhere beneath the conscious layer of his attention, the way a man is aware of a fire's warmth without thinking about the fire. And now, without any warning or announcement, the warmth was simply gone. He stood there for a beat longer than he should have. Then, Lord Ashcroft was at his elbow speaking about Parliament's latest session, and Edmund turned his attention to the conversation that was expected of him, and the moment passed. But it did not entirely pass. Through the next 2 hours, Edmund moved through his own evening with the practiced performance of a man who is entirely at ease, and he was aware with a low, persistent awareness that he could not quite dismiss that Victoria never once sought his eye. She circulated. She spoke. She managed the room with the quiet, invisible expertise he had always taken for granted. At dinner she sat at the opposite end of the long table as she always did, and she was charming to the guests seated near her, in a way that carried across the table in fragments of laughter and animated conversation. She simply never looked down the table at him. And Edmund, who had spent 2 years returning those glances with the minimum currency required, found himself for the first time looking at her and waiting. Beside him, Charles Alderton, a barrister and old acquaintance from Edmund's Cambridge years, leaned in with the conspiratorial ease of a man who had consumed enough Burgundy to be honest. "Is the Duchess displeased about something this evening?" Edmund reached for his wine glass with a steadiness that cost him something he couldn't name. "No, Victoria is too sensible for grievances of that kind." Alderton raised an eyebrow with the practiced skepticism of a man who had spent 20 years reading juries. "Is she?" Edmund did not answer. After dinner, when the guests had moved back to the drawing room, and the evening took on the slightly looser quality of its later hours, Edmund crossed the room and came to stand beside his wife for the first time all evening. Victoria turned to him with the pleasant composure of a hostess doing her job. "Edmund, are you enjoying the evening? It has been well managed." He meant it as a compliment. He heard it the moment it left his mouth as something else entirely. "The arrangements are very good. Thank you." She was already scanning the room with the alert, assessing gaze of a woman tracking 12 simultaneous social situations. "I believe Lord Ashcroft wants another word with you before he leaves. He's been angling toward you since dinner." Edmund looked at her. "Victoria. Is everything all right?" She turned to him then, and her gray eyes were perfectly clear, perfectly composed, perfectly pleasant. There was nothing in them he could name as unhappiness or anger or accusation. And somehow, that was worse than if there had been. "Everything is quite all right," she replied. "I'm going to check on Mrs. Hartley about the dessert service." And she moved away. Edmund stood in the warm, candle-lit room surrounded by 60 people he knew by name and reputation, and he felt for reasons he could not articulate entirely alone. Lord Ashcroft did find him, and Edmund managed the conversation that followed with his usual competence, and the evening concluded the way all Hartwell winter balls concluded successfully, admirably, in a way that would be spoken of favorably in drawing rooms across the county for the next several weeks. But long after the last carriage had rolled down the frost-hardened drive, and the candles had been extinguished, and the house had gone quiet, Edmund sat in his study with a glass of brandy he had not touched, and he thought about the particular quality of silence that had existed in his wife's eyes when she looked at him. Not cold, not angry, not wounded, empty, not of emotion. He understood in the first fully honest assessment he had made in longer than he cared to admit that it was not emptiness of feeling. It was emptiness of expectation. Victoria Ashford Fairchild had stopped expecting anything from him, and he had not noticed until the moment it was already done. He set the brandy glass down. For a long time, Edmund sat in his study in the dark and quiet house and tried to recall the last time he had asked his wife a question that was not logistical. The last time he had looked at her the way she apparently had been looking at him for 2 years. The last time he had done anything that would have told her she was seen. He could not find it. In the morning, everything proceeded as usual. Victoria was at breakfast before him, as she always was, working through the household correspondence with her customary efficiency. She looked up when he entered, greeted him with exactly the warmth that courtesy required, asked whether he would be home for dinner, noted that the weather had turned and the Eastfield tenants might be expecting a delay in one of the drainage repairs. All perfectly managed, all correctly done. Edmund watched her across the breakfast table and tried to remember when he had started accepting her competence as a feature of the house, rather than a quality of the woman. He could not find that moment either. The days that followed the winter ball had their own particular rhythm. Edmund returned to his business, the land dispute, the London meetings, the correspondence with the Agricultural Board that had been accumulating on his desk. Victoria continued to manage Hartwell Manor with the same precision and social intelligence she had always brought to it. On the surface, nothing had changed. But Edmund had started paying attention. He noticed now the things that had always been happening outside his field of vision. Victoria's morning visits to 2 of the tenant wives, Mrs. Calloway, whose husband had been ill since October, and old Mrs. Pratt, who was 81 and increasingly frail. The correspondence on Victoria's writing desk, which came from addresses he recognized as the neighboring estates, but which he had never once asked about. The way the housekeeper deferred to her, not with the obedience of someone following orders, but with the particular ease of someone who trusted the judgment of the person giving them. He noticed the way she moved through his house. Their house, he corrected himself. Though the correction felt thin, with the confidence of a woman who had learned its rhythms and shaped them to something better than they had been. He noticed that she no longer saved the seat beside her at dinner when they had guests, the way she had done for most of the first year. She managed the table arrangement to suit the social requirements of the evening, which meant Edmund sat wherever the arrangement placed him, and that was that. He had not noticed when she stopped. He noticed now that she had. 3 weeks after the winter ball, on a morning when the frost was thick and the light came in gray and reluctant. Through the study windows, Edmund went looking for his wife. He found her in the library. She was standing beside the tall east-facing bookcase, a letter in one hand and a volume of estate records open on the table before her. She was working clearly with the focused attention of someone midway through a problem, and she did not hear him come in. Edmund stopped in the doorway. Victoria reached out and turned a page in the estate records. Her lips moved slightly as she compared something in the letter to something in the volume. She made a small sound, the kind of quiet, unconscious acknowledgement a person makes when two pieces of information fit together the way they should. Then she set the letter down, picked up her pen, and made a notation in the margin. She was beautiful. He had always known this in the abstract, the way he knew that the east lawn was particularly well laid, and that the library was the best room in the house. But standing in the doorway watching her work, Edmund was struck by it with a specificity that the abstract had never produced. Not her face exactly, or the way the gray light fell across her dark hair, but the quality of her attention. The way she was entirely present in what she was doing, invested in it with a wholeness that he had spent 2 years failing to recognize as remarkable. He stepped into the library. Victoria looked up. Edmund. No warmth, no coldness. The clear, pleasant neutrality she had been offering him since December. "I didn't hear you come in." "I was looking for the Agricultural Board correspondence." He gestured vaguely toward the far shelves, though he had not actually been looking for it. "What are you working on?" "The Thornfield lease records." She glanced back at the volume. "There's a discrepancy in the boundary notation that goes back to 1871. I've been trying to establish the original survey documentation." Edmund moved to the table. He looked at the records, then at the letter in her hand. The notation she had made in the margin was precise, cross-referenced to 2 other dates and a name he recognized as the family that had held the Thornfield tenancy for 3 generations. "Is there a problem with the lease?" "Potentially." She set the letter down and folded her hands with the calm of someone who had already thought 3 steps past the immediate question. "If the boundary discrepancy is what I think it is, the Thornfield family has been paying on incorrect acreage for 14 years. The error is in our favor. It needs to be corrected." Edmund looked at her. "You found this?" "I found it in October." She reached for the letter again. "I've been gathering the documentation to be certain before bringing it to your solicitor." "You've been working on this since October, and you didn't tell me." Her gray eyes came up to meet his, and what he saw in them was not accusation or grievance, but something quieter and more difficult. The clear, steady patience of a woman who had answered this question 100 times before, even if not aloud. "You were occupied with the London business in October, and in November. I didn't think it required your immediate attention." "It involves the estate's finances. That always requires my attention." Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she said with great precision and no particular emotion, "I will make sure to bring matters of this kind to you sooner in future." It was the most correct possible answer, and it told him nothing, and he hated it. Edmund pulled a chair out and sat down at the table, an unusual thing for him to sit in the library in the middle of a morning, rather than retreating to his study with work to be done. He was not entirely certain why he did it. Victoria glanced at him, a small controlled flicker of something that was not quite surprise, and then returned her attention to the records. "How much is the discrepancy?" Edmund asked. She told him. It was not a small number, and you've been correcting it yourself. I've been preparing the documentation for correction. The correction itself requires your solicitor and the Thornfield family's agreement. But you didn't bring it to me. He was not accusing her exactly. He was trying to understand something, the shape of a thing that had been happening in his own house, in his own marriage, for longer than he was comfortable admitting. You handled it yourself. Victoria set her pen down. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had never in 2 years been anything less than honest with him, even when they were telling him things he had not been paying attention to hear. I handled what I could handle, she said. I always do. That is what I am here for. Edmund heard it. He heard the word she had chosen here, and the one she had not chosen, which was beside. He heard the subtle collapse of meaning between the two, and he understood, sitting in the library on a gray December morning, while his wife looked at him with the clear, patient eyes of a woman who had run out of a particular kind of hoping, that he had allowed something to happen inside this marriage that he could not, with any of his considerable skill and intelligence, simply decide to reverse. He had failed to see her, not maliciously, not deliberately, but thoroughly and consistently, and in the specific way that a man fails to see something that has always been there, not because it was hidden, but because he had never made the choice to look. Victoria turned back to her records. Edmund sat at the library table for another 10 minutes, which was 9 more than any reason required, and he watched his wife work, and he tried to calculate the precise cost of 2 years of not paying attention. The number, when he arrived at it, was considerable. He left the library without saying anything further. And Victoria, to her credit or her sorrow, he was no longer certain of the difference, did not watch him go. The library encounter stayed with Edmund longer than he expected. He returned to his study that morning and sat with his correspondence untouched for 20 minutes, which was, for a man who prided himself on the discipline of his days, a significant failure of routine. He turned the conversation over in his mind with the same careful attention he brought to any problem that resisted easy solution. Victoria's words had been entirely correct. Her manner had been entirely appropriate. There had been nothing he could point to as grievance, nothing he could address as complaint. And that he was beginning to understand was precisely the problem. She had stopped complaining. Not because things had improved, but because she had stopped believing that complaining would produce anything worth the effort of complaint. Edmund Fairchild was a man who had spent his entire adult life solving problems. He was exceptionally good at it. He could read a failing business arrangement and identify the fracture point with the precision of a surgeon identifying the source of a wound. He could navigate the treacherous social architecture of Westminster politics with the patience of a man who understood that leverage was built slowly and spent carefully. He had rebuilt his family's fortunes from the ground up through the application of clear thinking and decisive action. And there was almost nothing in his professional life that he could not give sufficient information and will fix. But he could not fix a thing he did not understand. And he did not, sitting in his study on a gray December morning, understand what had happened to his wife. I understood the surface of it. The winter ball. The library. The absence of the particular attention she had once given him without his ever having asked for it. He understood that she had changed. What he did not yet understand was why exactly. Not in the vague general sense that he had not been attentive enough, but in the specific granular sense that would tell him where the damage had actually occurred and what form it had taken. Edmund was not a man who could tolerate incomplete information. He picked up his pen and returned to his correspondence. But the work that day was slower than usual, and twice he found himself staring at a letter he had already read without retaining a single word of it. 3 evenings after the library, Edmund came home from a meeting in Cheltenham to find that Victoria had already dined without him. This was not technically unusual. His hours had always been uncertain, and Victoria had long since stopped organizing her meals around his schedule. But something about the particular emptiness of the dining room, the single-place setting at his usual chair, the evidence in the candlelight that the room had already been used and cleared, produced in him a feeling he did not immediately recognize because he had spent so little time experiencing it. It was the feeling of having been left out. He found Mrs. Hartley in the corridor and asked after the Duchess. the housekeeper informed him with the careful neutrality of a woman who had worked at Hartwell Manor long enough to understand the precise distance required between her observations and her expressions of them, that Her Grace had dined at 7 and was currently in the east sitting room with her correspondence. Edmund went to the east sitting room. Victoria was at the small writing table near the window, a lamp lit beside her, working through a stack of letters with methodical efficiency. She looked up when he came in. "Edmund, how was Cheltenham?" "Productive." He crossed to the chair nearest her table and sat again without quite having planned to. "What are you working on?" "Letters." She continued writing as she answered the neat, precise strokes of a woman who did not waste motion. "Mrs. Calloway's youngest daughter is being considered for a position in Bath. I've written to Lady Fenwick on her behalf." Edmund watched her write. "Lady Fenwick is the one with the house on Royal Crescent. Her son's house, yes. He runs a respectable establishment, and Lady Fenwick has influence with the household staff decisions." Victoria blotted the letter and reached for the next envelope. "The girl is 17 and very capable. It would be a good situation for her." "You know the Calloway family well." "I've visited Mrs. Calloway regularly since October. Her husband's illness has made things very difficult for them." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He thought about the East Field drainage work that had been delayed, the same East Field where the Calloway tenancy sat. He thought about how long that repair had been on his list, and how it had continued to slip in priority behind matters that seemed from his desk more immediately pressing. "Is the family managing?" Victoria set down her pen and looked at him with a directness that he was only now beginning to recognize as something she had always possessed, and he had simply never spent enough time facing to notice. "They are managing because I have been making sure they manage," she answered. "Mr. Calloway will not recover his full strength before spring. The drainage delay means the East Field is producing less than it should, which means the family's portion is short. I've been supplementing from the household account." Edmund straightened. "Without telling me." "I told you about the drainage delay in September." Her voice was even without accusation, which was worse than accusation would have been. "You said you would look into it. In October I mentioned it again. You were in London." The silence that followed was not comfortable. "How much have you supplemented?" Edmund asked. She told him the figure. It was not unreasonable. In fact, it was carefully calibrated, the exact amount needed, and not a penny beyond it, which told him that she had thought about this with the precision of someone who understood estate management better than she had ever been given credit for. "I'll have the drainage repair scheduled for January," he said, "before the spring planting." "Thank you." Victoria returned to her correspondence. Edmund watched her for another moment. "Victoria, you could have told me about the Calloways at any point." She picked up her pen, and what she said next was quiet, deliberate, and perfectly controlled. "Yes, I could have." And that was all. No elaboration. No grievance attached. Just the clean, precise acknowledgement of a fact that required nothing further from her. Edmund went to bed that night with the particular restlessness of a man who understands that he is losing something but cannot yet fully see what. The weeks between Christmas and the New Year moved at the slow, compressed pace of a house that has discharged its social obligations and turned inward. The great event calendar of the Hartwell winter was finished. The guests were gone. The county families had retreated to their own estates. And in the quieter days that followed, the shape of Edmund and Victoria's marriage became visible with an uncomfortable clarity that the busy social season had made it easy to avoid. They moved through the same house with the courteous efficiency of two people who had agreed to share a space without discussing the terms. Victoria managed the household and the tenants and the social correspondence that continued even in the quiet weeks. Edmund managed the estate finances and the London obligations and the agricultural board matters that had accumulated through December. They ate dinner together on the evenings when Edmund was home, and their conversation was intelligent and pleasant, and never once touched anything that mattered. Edmund noticed. He had started noticing since the winter ball, with a precision he had not previously applied to the domestic architecture of his days. He noticed that Victoria never sat in the drawing room in the evenings anymore. She had moved her evening reading to the east sitting room, which was smaller and required no fire to be lit for her. He noticed that she no longer mentioned social events to him in the anticipatory way she once had, the way a woman describes an upcoming evening to a husband she hopes will be interested. She mentioned events the way a secretary mentions appointments informationally without investment. He noticed that she never waited. For the first 18 months of their marriage, Victoria had possessed the quality charming he had thought abstractly when he thought of it at all, of a woman who occupied temporary states with grace. She would wait for him to finish a conversation before she left a room. She would hold a thought, hold a question, hold the first portion of a meal in the silent accommodating patience of someone who expected that the wait would be worth it. She did not do this anymore. She ate when dinner was served, and left rooms when she was ready to leave them, and conducted her business on the schedule that suited her business. It was entirely reasonable. It was entirely within her right. And it produced in Edmund the specific discomfort of a man who has received a correction he cannot dispute. The third week of January brought a letter from Lord Hargreave of Norbury Hall, a peer whose land abutted the Hartwell estate on the southern boundary, and whose relationship with Edmund had always been cordial and carefully maintained. Hargreave was writing about a drainage consortium, 3 neighboring estates, including Hartwell pooling resources for a shared infrastructure improvement that would benefit all 3 landholdings significantly. It was a sound plan. Hargreave outlined the terms with the brevity of a man who assumed his correspondent would grasp the essentials quickly. Edmund brought the letter to dinner that evening. He had been in the habit since December of making small attempts. He was not certain he would have called them that attempts, but that is what they were. He asked Victoria's opinion on the new cook's proposed spring menu. He mentioned a conversation he'd had with his solicitor. He passed along the occasional piece of social news he had encountered in Cheltenham. These were small things, imperfect things, and he knew they were imperfect. But they were movement after the long stillness, and he offered them with the care of a man aware that he was operating on uncertain ground. He placed the Hargreave letter beside her plate. "I'd be interested in your view on this." Victoria read it. She took her time, which was one of the qualities he had always valued in her judgment. She read things fully before speaking about them, a discipline he had noticed and never commented on. When she finished, she set the letter down with the particular deliberateness that meant she had an opinion and was organizing it. "The terms are reasonable," she said. "The shared cost is equitable given the acreage involved. But the management arrangement gives Hargreave disproportionate oversight of the timeline, and Hargreave is a man who moves slowly when speed isn't in his immediate interest." Edmund looked at her. "You know Hargreave." "Lady Hargreave and I have corresponded since October. She mentioned this consortium idea 3 months ago. It originated with her, actually not with Lord Hargreave." A brief, precise pause. "He presents it as his own. She doesn't mind. She's pragmatic." Edmund set down his wine glass. "You knew about this in October." "I knew Lady Hargreave was developing the concept in October. I didn't know it had reached the stage of a formal proposal. And you didn't mention it." Victoria looked at him across the table with the same clear, patient gray eyes that had been telling him things he was only recently learning to hear. "At the time I mentioned things in October," she replied, "I was not generally invited to continue." The words landed with a precision that no weapon could have bettered because they were not weaponized. They were simply true, delivered in the tone of a woman who was done softening truth for the comfort of the person receiving it. Edmund sat with it. "The consortium is a good opportunity," Victoria continued, as though nothing particular had been established between them. "But I would recommend negotiating the oversight terms before agreeing. And I would suggest speaking with Lady Hargreave directly in addition to her husband. She has a clearer understanding of the practical details." "You could speak with Lady Hargreave," Edmund offered, "given that you already have the correspondence established." "I will if you'd like." She picked up her fork. "I can write to her tomorrow." It was agreed. And Edmund noted without saying anything that Victoria had offered to do this without a single indication that it was unusual, remarkable, or worth acknowledgement because it was not for her. She had been doing things of this kind since the beginning of their marriage smoothly and without fanfare, and he had been accepting them the way a man accepts the quality of well-maintained roads, without curiosity about the labor that produced them, Lady Hargreaves' response arrived within a week, and it was detailed, warm, and contained 3 significant pieces of information about the consortium's practical terms that Lord Hargreaves' formal letter had not included. Edmund read it. Then he read it again. Then he went looking for his wife. He found her in the blue morning room with Mrs. Hartley working through the household accounts for January. He stood in the doorway long enough for Victoria to notice him, which she did with a glance and a brief nod before he went to wait in the corridor. She joined him in 4 minutes, which was exactly how long she needed to finish the point she had been making, because Victoria did not abandon sentences midway through them. Lady Hargreaves' response, Edmund said, and held out the letter. Victoria read it without apparent surprise at any of its contents. She's very direct and in private correspondence was all she offered. She says the geological assessment on the southern boundary was done incorrectly. She says the original survey missed a drainage channel that goes back to the 1840s. Yes? Victoria folded the letter and handed it back. She mentioned this possibility when we first corresponded. I didn't raise it with you because I hadn't confirmed it. Edmund looked at his wife. He looked at her for long enough that a slight shift moved through her, not discomfort exactly, but the contained awareness of someone being examined with more attention than they had recently grown accustomed to. You have been managing relationships with every major landowner in this county, he said, and I have had no idea. You have had every idea. Her voice was quiet and very steady. You simply have not asked. It was the most honest thing she had said to him in months, and it hit with the force of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. Not cruel. Not heated. Delivered in the tone of a woman stating a fact that was already finished, that had already been survived, that required nothing from him now except the dignity of acknowledgement. Edmund had no answer for it. He pocketed Lady Hargreaves' letter and walked back to his study, and he sat there for a long time in the gray January afternoon and thought about asking. The specific shape of it asking. It was such a small word. A man of his position, his history, his particular self-sufficiency had not built his life around asking. He had built it around deciding. He had decided his business strategy and his estate management and his political alliances, and 2 years ago his marriage. He had decided all of these things with the practiced confidence of a man who trusted his own judgment and had been repeatedly vindicated in that trust. But trust in one's own judgment, Edmund was slowly uncomfortably discovering, was only as sound as the information one's judgment was operating on. And for 2 years, he had been making decisions about his marriage with profoundly incomplete information because he had never once thought to ask the person sitting across from him at dinner what she knew, what she thought, what she had already done 3 steps ahead of him without his awareness. He pulled out a sheet of writing paper. He sat there for another 10 minutes, then put the paper away, because there was nothing he could write that would address the specific problem he was facing, and he was man enough to know it. The Hargreave Consortium negotiations proceeded over the following 3 weeks, and they proceeded well better than they would have without Victoria's groundwork with Lady Hargreave, a fact that Edmund was acutely aware of, and that he mentioned to Victoria once briefly over dinner. She received the acknowledgement with a nod and turned the conversation to the matter of the Eastfield drainage repair, which the January schedule had pushed to late February, and which she had already communicated to the Calloway family. He noticed that she did not seem particularly gratified by the acknowledgement, not because she was indifferent to it. He thought he was no longer willing to make that assessment, but because he was beginning to understand a single acknowledgement after 2 years was not currency of sufficient weight to purchase the particular warmth that had once been present and was now not. A thank you offered 2 years late was not the same thing as a thank you offered in time. Victoria knew this. She had always known this, and she was not going to pretend otherwise for his comfort. He respected it. He found it painful. He was not sure those 2 things were in conflict. February brought Edmund to London for a 10-day series of parliamentary meetings, the kind of obligation that could not be deferred, and that took him away from the estate at a time when the Hargreave Consortium terms were still being finalized. He told Victoria he would be back by the 22nd. He gave Mrs. Hartley his address in London in case any urgent estate matter arose. He stood in the front hall with his coat and his bag, And for the first time in 2 years, he looked at his wife when he was leaving. He looked at her the way she had once looked at him, with the full attention of someone who wanted to be sure of a thing before it passed. "The East Field repair," he said. "If the surveyor comes before I return, you have my authority to approve the work." "I know." She was arranging the scarf at his collar, with the brief, efficient touch of a woman managing a practical matter, and she did not look up while she did it. "Victoria." He waited until she finished. "When I return, I would like to sit down with you, properly, about the estate matters, all of them. The Hargreave situation, the Thornfield lease, the Calloway family, all of it." She looked up then. Her gray eyes were clear and very careful. "You want a briefing," she said. "I want a conversation." The distinction hung between them for a beat. He felt it, the difference between those two words, the small and enormous distance between them. Victoria felt it too. He could see it in the slight change in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something that was not the smooth, pleasant distance she had been maintaining. Something more honest. "All right," she said. "When you return." He left Hartwell Manor on the morning of the 12th of February, and the carriage had cleared the estate drive before he realized that he had been holding his breath until she agreed. London was busy and demanding in the way London always was, and Edmund moved through his 10 days there with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew this world entirely. The meetings were productive. The political relationships he cultivated yielded the results they were intended to yield. He dined with colleagues at his club and attended 2 evening engagements that were more strategic than social, and handled both with the ease of long practice. But he wrote to Victoria on the 4th day. Not about estate business. Not about the consortium, or the Calloway drainage, or the Thornfield lease. He wrote about a lecture he had attended one of the Royal Institution's public evenings on the subject of geological survey methods and their application to agricultural land assessment, which he had attended on something of an impulse. He wrote that the lecturer had made several points that seemed directly relevant to the Hargreave Consortium's southern boundary question, and that he had taken notes and would bring them back. He paused with his pen over the last paragraph for a moment. Then he wrote, "I thought you would find the geological point interesting. The argument about the 1840s drainage maps is more complex than Hargreave's letter suggested." He sent it before he could reconsider. Victoria's response arrived on the 7th day. It was not long. It covered the East Field repair. The surveyor had come, she had approved the work, it would begin when the ground was sufficiently dry, and 2 other estate matters of the kind she had previously handled without telling him. At the bottom of the page, in the same neat, precise hand, she had written, "The geological argument is interesting. I'd read that the original survey commission for this region was politically motivated and may have been deliberately incomplete. I'll look for the relevant documentation before you return." Edmund read that last paragraph 3 times. It was not warmth. It was not the turning of a tide. But it was Victoria speaking to him, not managing him, not navigating around him, but actually speaking to him the way a person speaks to someone they believe is listening. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket. On the morning of the 22nd of February, Edmund returned to Hartwell Manor. Victoria was not in the front hall when he arrived. This did not surprise him. He had not telegraphed his exact arrival time, and he was not the kind of man who expected his household to arrange itself around his comings and goings. He gave his coat to the footman, asked after Mrs. Hartley, and went to find his wife. She was in the library. Of course, she was in the library. He had come to understand in the weeks since December that the library was where Victoria went when she had serious work to do. Not the east sitting room, which was for letters and lighter thinking, but the library with the tall shelves and the estate records and the morning light that came in cold and clear and useful. She looked up when he came in. "You're back earlier than I expected. The roads were better than I anticipated." He sat down across from her at the table, the chair that had become, without either of them naming it, the chair he used when he came to find her here. "How is the East Field?" "The survey is done. The drainage problem is exactly where I thought it was. The repair crew can start Monday if the temperature holds." She reached across the table and pushed a folder toward him. "The Thornfield lease documentation is there. I've also drafted a letter to the Thornfield family explaining the acreage correction and our intention to adjust the lease accordingly. Edmund opened the folder. The documentation was meticulous. Everything cross-referenced, every date accounted for the discrepancy laid out in a way that made the correction not only obvious, but legally unassailable. He looked through it for 3 solid minutes. This is thorough. It needed to be thorough. The family has been paying incorrectly for 14 years. They deserve to understand exactly what happened and why it's being corrected. You drafted the apology letter as well. Draft, she corrected. You'll want to review it, and probably sign it yourself. It should come from the Duke, not from me. Edmund looked up from the folder. And the geological documentation for the Hargreave Consortium. Victoria reached to a different stack of papers on her left and produced 3 pages of close-written notes with 2 folded maps tucked behind them. The 1843 commission was politically compromised, she said with the quiet authority of someone who had done the research and was now simply reporting it. The surveyor had a financial relationship with the Hargreave family's predecessor, not Lord Hargreave's father, but his grandfather. The survey was drawn to benefit that earlier land arrangement and has been causing confusion ever since. Lady Hargreave knows. I believe she has known for some time. Edmund set down the folder. He looked at his wife. He looked at the maps and the notes and the lease documentation and the careful, thorough work of months that had proceeded entirely without his involvement or awareness. He thought about what it had cost her, not the time, not the effort, but the other thing. The thing that a woman pays when she does remarkable work inside a structure that does not see the person doing it. When she accomplishes things, not because anyone asked, but because she has understood from the beginning that someone must. Victoria. He said her name and then stopped, because what came next required more precision than he had immediately available. She waited. She was still doing that, giving him time, giving him space. The disciplined patience of a woman who had learned that rushing men toward honesty produced nothing worth having. You have been running this estate, Edmund said carefully. Not managing the household, running the estate, the tenant relationships, the boundary disputes, the consortium groundwork, the lease discrepancies, all of it. I have been doing what needed doing. You have been doing my job alongside yours. He kept his voice level because this was not a moment for anything but absolute precision. And I have been crediting the estate's smooth functioning to my own management, when the truth is that a very significant portion of it has been yours. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. Not the careful managed distance of 2 people navigating around each other, but something with weight to it, the silence of a thing being named for the first time after existing unnamed for a long while. Victoria looked at him. He could not quite read her expression, which was new. He had always assumed he could read her, and he was only now discovering that he had been reading the surface of her for 2 years, and calling it her depth. "What are you going to do with that information?" she asked. Edmund met her eyes. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I'm not going to go on pretending I don't have it." It was not enough. He knew, sitting across from her in the February light with her months of work spread across the table between them, that it was nowhere near enough. 2 years of not paying attention could not be addressed in a single library conversation in winter. But it was the most honest thing Edmund Fairchild had said to his wife in the entire 2 years of their marriage. And Victoria, for the first time since December, did not immediately look away. Victoria did not look away. But she did not move toward him either. That was the truth of it. The particular honest truth of where they stood after Edmund's admission in the library that February afternoon. Something had shifted. Not repaired, not restored, but shifted the way a long locked door shifts when the right key finally enters before anyone has decided whether to actually open it. Victoria had heard him. She had registered the honesty in what he said with the same precision she brought to everything, and she had not dismissed it. But neither had she softened. She gathered her papers from the table with the same calm efficiency that had become Edmund now understood not a sign of indifference, but a form of self-protection, so deeply habituated she may not have been aware of it herself. She thanked him for returning early. She mentioned that dinner would be at 7. And she left the library in the same quiet way she had been leaving rooms for 3 months, without drama, without slamming doors, without any of the obvious signals that would have given Edmund a clear target to address. I was beginning to understand that her restraint was not composure. It was endurance. And endurance, unlike anger, could not be resolved with a single conversation. The weeks that followed moved with a tension that lived entirely beneath the surface of their days. Edmund had returned from London with the intention of doing things differently, and he was trying imperfectly with the particular clumsiness of a man who had spent his entire life deciding rather than asking, and who was now attempting to learn an entirely new way of operating. He asked Victoria's opinion on the Hargreave Consortium's revised terms before he signed them. He brought the Thornfield lease correction to his solicitor, along with Victoria's documentation, and gave her name as the author of the research, which produced a brief startled silence from the solicitor that Edmund found more revealing than he expected. He approved the Eastfield drainage repair on the schedule Victoria had outlined, and asked her to communicate the timeline directly to the Calloway family, because she knew them, and he didn't, and it was past time to stop pretending otherwise. These were not large gestures. He knew they were not large gestures, but they were real ones, and they were consistent, and he offered them without expectation of immediate return, because he had enough self-awareness now to understand that expecting immediate return would be precisely the wrong thing. Victoria received each of them with the careful, measured acknowledgement of a woman who had learned to be precise in what she allowed herself to feel. The first week of March brought the annual accounting of the Hartwell estate's agricultural yields, a significant undertaking that Edmund managed personally each year with his estate manager Thomas Ridley, a reliable and competent man who had served the Fairchild family for 15 years. Ridley was thorough and honest, but he was not. Edmund had privately assessed over several years, particularly creative in his thinking. He managed what was already established. He did not anticipate. The yield accounting revealed a problem. The eastern portion of the Hartwell landholding. 3 parcels in total, including the Calloway tenancy, had underperformed for the 3rd consecutive year. Not catastrophically, but persistently in the specific pattern that indicated structural rather than seasonal cause. Ridley's assessment was that the soil quality in the east parcels had declined due to overplanting, and he recommended a rotation schedule that would reduce yield further in the short term while rebuilding the soil over 3 to 5 years. Edmund reviewed the numbers. He reviewed Ridley's rotation recommendation. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he did something he had never done before in 15 years of managing Hartwell's agricultural affairs. He brought the accounting documents to Victoria. He found her in the east sitting room, her correspondence hour, the one she kept religiously between 10 and noon, regardless of what else demanded her attention. She looked up when he came in, and he could see her recalibrating. He had never come to her correspondence hour before, and she was deciding what it meant. He set the agricultural documents on the table beside her writing things. "I'd like your view on this," Edmund said. "Take the time you need. I'm not in a hurry." Victoria looked at the documents. She looked at him. Then she picked up the first page and began to read. She did not speak for 11 minutes. Edmund sat across from her and waited, and he did not fill the silence with his own assessment or his own conclusions, which cost him more than he would have liked to admit. "Ridley's rotation recommendation is reasonable," Victoria said at last, setting the pages down with the deliberateness that meant she had more than one thought and was organizing them into the right order. "But it assumes the problem is uniform across all 3 parcels, and it isn't. The Calloway parcel has a different soil profile than the 2 parcels north of it. The drainage problem that was just repaired has been suppressing the Calloway yield. Specifically, the other 2 parcels have a different underlying issue." Edmund leaned forward. "What underlying issue?" "The tenant rotation on the northern parcels has been managed without adequate crop variation for 12 years. She turned to the second page and pointed to a column of numbers he had skimmed past. "Look at the planting records. The same 3 crops, the same sequence since 1874. Ridley's rotation will help, but not if it applies the same 3 crops in a different order. The soil needs something entirely different introduced." Edmund looked at the column she was indicating. She was right. He could see it now that she had named it. The pattern was obvious once identified, and he had looked directly at it twice without seeing it. How do you know the soil profile of the Callaway parcel is different from the northern ones? Because I have visited the Callaway family regularly for 4 months, and I have eyes, Victoria replied with the only trace of dry humor she had allowed herself in 3 months. The drainage problem produced a specific kind of root damage in the Callaway field that I have not seen in the northern parcels. The plants tell you what the soil is doing if you are paying attention to the plants. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Ridley doesn't know any of this. Ridley is a good estate manager, she answered, measured and fair. But he makes his assessments from documents and from conversations with the tenants, and the tenants have been reluctant to tell him directly that the rotation plan isn't working. They don't want to appear ungrateful or difficult. But they told you. Mrs. Callaway told me. A brief pause. Over tea, which I have been having with her every other Tuesday. Edmund sat back. He looked at his wife. Really looked at her with the specific and overdue attention of a man who is counting what he has failed to see and finding the total staggering. Victoria Ashford Fairchild had spent 4 months building trust with a tenant family that he had been managing at the level of a ledger entry. She had done it not strategically, not because anyone told her it was useful, but because a woman's husband was ill and the family was struggling, and she had simply shown up, and in doing so, she had learned things about his estate that he did not know. I'll revise the rotation recommendation with Ridley, Edmund said. I'll need you to come to that meeting. The slight shift in Victoria's expression was not dramatic, but he caught it, the faint recalibration of a woman who had just heard something she had not expected. You want me at the estate meeting. You have information Ridley doesn't have, and I should have had months ago. Yes. He met her eyes directly. I would like you at the meeting. She looked at him for a moment, with the gray eyes that had spent 2 years being honest with him, whether or not he was paying attention to receive that honesty. All right, she said. The meeting with Ridley took place the following Thursday. It was by the standards of estate business meetings an unusual morning. Ridley arrived at 9 with his files and his professional composure, and the untroubled confidence of a man who expected to present his assessment and have it approved. He was a decent man, and he knew his field. And when Edmund introduced Victoria's participation with the direct simplicity of a man who was not offering explanation or apology for it, Ridley adjusted without visible resistance because he was practical enough to understand that the Duke's instruction was the Duke's instruction. Victoria presented her observations about the northern parcel's crop variation problem with the clarity and precision of someone who had been thinking about it for weeks and was now delivering a conclusion fully formed. Ridley listened. His expression moved through 3 distinct stages. Initial polite attention, genuine consideration, and then the specific look of a man who has just recognized information that reframes something he thought he understood. The crop variation point is sound, Ridley acknowledged with the professional integrity of a man who put the estate's welfare above his own assessment. I should have caught it from the planting records. The pattern isn't obvious at first look, Victoria replied without magnanimity and without triumph. It becomes clear when you read the records alongside the yield data from the same period. Ridley turned to Edmund. Her Grace's analysis is more specific than my rotation plan accounts for. I'd recommend we rebuild the schedule around it. Edmund looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the table. That seems correct to me, Edmund said. They spent 2 more hours working through the revised schedule. Victoria answered Ridley's questions with the same precise, unfussy knowledge she had applied to everything else. No performance, no overstatement. Just the information she had and the reasoning behind it. By the time Ridley left, the rotation plan had been substantially reconceived, and the estate's eastern parcels had a realistic path to recovery that did not require 3 years of diminished yield. After Ridley was gone, Edmund and Victoria sat in the study in the brief quiet that follows the conclusion of a substantial piece of work. It was not uncomfortable. It was something newer and more careful than comfort, the specific kind of quiet that exists between 2 people who have just worked well together for the first time and are both aware of it. Thank you, Edmund said. Victoria looked up. For what specifically? For the crop analysis, for the Callaway information, for coming to the meeting. He held her gaze. "For the past 4 months of estate work that I have been profiting from without acknowledgement." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said precisely, and without softness, "One meeting does not balance 2 years, Edmund." He did not flinch from it. "No, it doesn't." She gathered her papers. He watched her, and he thought about what it meant that statement offered without heat, without performance, simply as the plain arithmetic of what was true. She was not punishing him. She was not withholding warmth as a strategy. She was simply telling him the truth because she was a woman who had always told him the truth, and he had spent 2 years not quite listening closely enough to hear it. The crisis arrived in the second week of March. It arrived in the form of a letter not to Edmund, but to Victoria from Lady Hargreave. Edmund only knew about it because Victoria brought it to him, which itself was a change significant enough that he registered it. The letter was not long, but what it contained was considerable. Lord Hargreave had, without consulting his wife or either of the other consortium partners, engaged a separate surveying firm to reassess the southern boundary. The same boundary where Victoria had identified the politically compromised 1843 survey. The new survey had been commissioned by Hargreave in his own name, which meant its findings would be presented as Hargreave's discovery, and the consortium terms would be renegotiated from a position that gave Hargreave significant additional leverage. Lady Hargreave was warning them. She was warning them because Victoria had been honest with her, and honesty in her long experience was rare enough to be worth protecting. Edmund read the letter once. Then he set it flat on his desk with the controlled stillness of a man who is very angry and is not going to allow the anger to run ahead of the thinking. "Hargreave commissioned this independently," he said, "while the consortium negotiations were active." "While the consortium negotiations were active," Victoria confirmed. She was standing on the other side of his desk, not sitting, which told him this was not a conversation she planned to be in for long. "Lady Hargreave believes he has had the survey findings for 3 weeks. He has not disclosed them." Edmund looked at Victoria. "The original boundary discrepancy, the one you found in the Thornfield records. Does it intersect with the southern boundary survey question?" Victoria's expression shifted not surprise, but recognition. The particular look of a person who has just seen 2 things connect that she had been holding separately. "The 1843 survey covered both boundaries," she said slowly. "The same commissioner, the same political arrangement. I focused on the Thornfield lease because it was the most immediate problem. But if the southern boundary survey was compromised by the same commission, then Hargreave's new survey, maybe correcting something that properly corrected, does not benefit Hargreave at all." Edmund was already reaching for the Thornfield files. "It may benefit Hartwell." The next 4 hours were the most sustained working collaboration of their marriage. They pulled every document Victoria had gathered on the 1843 Survey Commission, the research she had done in February, the materials she had located through 3 different county archives with the tenacious, methodical thoroughness that was entirely her own. They spread them across the library table and worked through them together. Edmund reading for the legal and financial implications, while Victoria read for the historical and geographic context, and where their findings intersected. They talked through the intersection with the focused, rapid efficiency of 2 people who had, it turned out, very compatible minds. It was Edmund who found the ownership notation buried in a supplementary appendix of the 1843 Commission report, written in the cramped hand of a clerk who had not understood the significance of what he was recording. A single paragraph, 8 lines, establishing that the drainage channel Victoria had identified in the February research was, and had been for 40 years prior to the 1843 survey, indisputably within the Hartwell estate's boundary. Not the Hargreave boundary, Hartwell's. The 1843 survey had moved that boundary, incorrectly, deliberately in the service of the political arrangement between Hargreave's grandfather and the survey commissioner. Edmund set the document down. He looked at Victoria. She was looking at the same paragraph, and her expression was the expression of a person reading something that confirms what they suspected and surprises them nonetheless. "This means the Southern Consortium terms are built on a false boundary," Edmund said. "It means Hargreave's new survey may be identifying the same discrepancy." Victoria looked up. "Means Hargreave already knows this, and he commissioned his own survey so that when the correction is made, it appears to originate with him rather than with us." The room was very quiet. "He intended to present it in consortium negotiations as his own finding," Edmund said, "giving him the leverage of having identified the problem when the problem has been sitting in our archive for 40 years. Victoria held his gaze steadily. "Yes." Edmund stood up from the library table. He moved to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and Victoria watched him and did not rush him, because she understood with the particular intelligence of a woman who had spent 2 years reading this man's silences that he was not at the window because he was troubled. He was at the window because he was thinking. He turned around. "You found this," he said. "The 1843 Commission research, the Thornfield records, all of it. You did this in October and November and December and January while I was—" He stopped, started again. "While I was treating you as though you were managing the household." Victoria's chin came up very slightly. "I was doing what I could do with what I had. You were doing what I should have been doing alongside you." His voice was not loud. It was the voice of a man who has arrived at a reckoning and is going to go through it without flinching, because that is the only decent thing left to do. "Victoria, I owe you an apology that I cannot make adequately in this room. But I am going to begin by making it inadequately, because the alternative is continuing to owe it." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Not softness, not warmth, but something older and more complicated than either. The specific look of a woman hearing words she stopped expecting to hear, and not yet certain whether to trust them. "You don't need to," she began. "I do." He crossed the library and came to stand at the other side of the table, not closing the distance between them, but facing it directly. "You have spent 2 years working for this estate and for this marriage with a commitment and an intelligence that I have never once adequately acknowledged. I have taken credit implicitly and explicitly for work that was substantially yours. I have treated your contributions as the expected function of your position rather than the considerable achievement of a capable person. And I have done all of this while believing myself to be, by the standards of my world, a decent husband." Victoria did not move. She stood very still, the way she did when she was absorbing something significant, processing it with the full depth of her attention before responding. "Were you ever going to stop?" The question was quiet and direct, the question of a woman who needed the truth more than she needed to be managed. "If I had not stopped looking at you that night in December, if I had continued exactly as I was, were you ever going to see what I was doing?" The question landed like a stone into still water, and the rings it made would have expanded outward for a long time if either of them had let it. Edmund did not look away from her. He owed her that much at minimum, the full, uncomfortable honesty of his own assessment. "I don't know," he said. It was the only answer that was true, and they both knew it. Victoria exhaled a small, controlled breath that released something she had been holding. Not relief exactly, not release, but the particular settling of a person who has been waiting to know the shape of a thing and has finally seen it. "Then we need to deal with Hargreave," she said. The shift back to the practical was so swift and so characteristic that Edmund almost missed what it represented, that she had heard him registered it and chosen to keep moving rather than stop to examine whether she believed it. That was not dismissal. That was the behavior of a woman who had learned to protect herself by not investing too quickly in things that had not yet proven themselves. He understood it. He accepted it. He turned back to the documents on the library table. "Hargreave cannot present this as his own discovery if we have the prior documentation," Edmund said. "We need to formally establish the Hartwell estate's claim to the research before his survey findings are submitted to the consortium." "We need to write to the consortium's independent solicitor today," Victoria said, already reaching for paper. "Not tomorrow. Today, with the 1843 Commission documents attached. Lady Hargreave needs to know as well. I'll write to her separately. She trusted me with this information. She deserves to know that her trust was not wasted." Victoria was already writing the same neat, rapid strokes of a woman who had done this kind of thing many times and did not need to think about the mechanics of it. "Edmund, the survey commissioner's name in the 1843 appendix. Can you confirm the spelling?" It needs to be exact. Edmund looked at the document. He read her the name. They worked until the light failed. By the time Mrs. Hartley came to inform them quietly that dinner had been ready for 40 minutes and was being kept warm, they had produced a letter to the consortium solicitor, a separate communication to Lady Hargreave, and a formal legal summary of the boundary evidence that could withstand scrutiny from any party Hargreave might choose to engage. All of it signed by both of them. Edmund's signature as Duke of Hartwell Victoria's, as the author of the underlying research, because Edmund had insisted on the latter, and Victoria had not argued. She had looked at her name on the formal document for a moment, with an expression he could not quite read. Then she had folded it and sealed it. At dinner, they were quiet in the way that people are quiet after hard work. Not the managed distance of earlier months, but the more companionable quiet of two people who have just spent 6 hours solving a difficult problem together and do not need to narrate it. Edmund refilled Victoria's wineglass without asking. She passed him the bread without being asked. These were small things, mechanical things, but they were the small mechanics of two people occupying the same space with awareness of each other, and they had not existed between the two of them in longer than Edmund cared to calculate. When dinner was finished and Mrs. Hartley had cleared, Victoria sat with her wine and looked across the table with the direct assessing gaze that he was finally beginning to recognize as her natural state, not managed, not performed, but genuinely present. "I have a question," she said. Edmund held her gaze. "Ask it." "When you go to the consortium meeting next week, and Hargreave learns that the boundary research originated with Hartwell and specifically with me, what will you say?" I understood the full weight of the question. In 1886, in the aristocratic world, they both inhabited a duke who acknowledged publicly that a significant piece of estate research had been conducted by his wife was making a social statement that had consequences. Not scandalous consequences, but meaningful ones. He would be acknowledged as a man whose wife had visible intellectual authority in their shared affairs. There were men in his circle who would find this peculiar. Some would find it amusing. Edmund looked at Victoria across the dinner table in the warm quiet of their dining room, and he thought about what it meant that she had asked, that she had not assumed, had not expected, had not demanded. She had asked because she had learned not to expect things from him, and because she was still even now watching to see what he would do with what he had said. "I will say exactly what is true," Edmund answered. "That the Duchess of Hartwell identified the boundary discrepancy, conducted the archival research, and produced the documentation that protects the Hartwell estate's legal position." He paused for exactly one beat. "And I will say it without qualifying it." Victoria was very still. "Why?" The word came out quieter than she intended, he thought more honest than she meant to be. "Because it is true," Edmund said. "And because I have been allowing things that are true to go unacknowledged for 2 years, and I am finished doing that." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. Victoria looked at him across the table for a long moment. Her gray eyes were very clear, and Edmund could see for the first time with the full and overdue attention he should have brought to looking 2 years ago, not the managed composure she had been offering him for months, but something underneath it. Something that had been there all along, patient and persistent, waiting to be seen. She was not ready to offer him everything. He understood that. What had been built up over 2 years could not be dismantled and rebuilt in a single evening, regardless of how honest the evening had been. But she did not look away. And Edmund Fairchild, who had spent his entire life being the most powerful person in every room he entered, and who had never until now understood how little that meant when the person beside him had quietly stopped believing he saw her, sat with that and accepted it, and did not look away either. The consortium meeting was held on the 18th of March at Norbury Hall. Edmund had attended dozens of meetings in rooms like that. One-long tables, leather chairs, the particular stillness of men who have power and know how to use the architecture of formality to display it. He was comfortable in such rooms. He had always been comfortable in such rooms. But he walked into Norbury Hall that morning carrying something he had never brought to a meeting of this kind before, which was the full weight of another person's work, and the intention to present it as exactly that. Lord Hargreave received him with the smooth, expansive warmth of a man who believed he held all the significant cards. Hargreave was 61, broad-shouldered, with the ruddy confidence of someone who had inherited significant land and had never had serious cause to doubt his own judgment. He shook Edmund's hand with the heartiness of a man performing goodwill, and Edmund shook back with the economy of a man who had stopped performing anything. The third consortium partner, Sir William Ford of Ashby Cross, arrived 20 minutes later. A quiet, methodical man who ran his estate with competence and minimal drama, and who had expressed in his prior correspondence with Edmund a concern about the consortium's timeline that aligned precisely with what Victoria had identified months ago. Edmund had written to Ford the previous week. Not about the boundary evidence he had saved that for the room, but about the timeline concern. Enough to establish an alliance before the meeting began. Hargreave opened the proceedings with the practiced ease of a man who had prepared his material and expected to control the conversation. He spoke at length about the infrastructure improvements, the projected costs, the timeline he proposed. And then, with the particular deliberateness of a man producing a surprise he had been rehearsing, he introduced his new survey findings. "I took the initiative," Hargreave announced, spreading the survey documents across the table with the satisfaction of a man laying down a winning hand, of commissioning an independent reassessment of the southern boundary. Given the complexity of the terrain and the historical survey questions, I felt the consortium required current verified data before finalizing terms. Edmund watched him. He said nothing. "The findings are significant." Hargreave tapped the top document. The 1843 survey underrepresented the drainage channel capacity by a substantial margin. The corrected boundary places the primary infrastructure requirement squarely within what had previously been considered shared jurisdiction, which affects the cost allocation considerably. Ford leaned forward to examine the documents. Edmund did not move. Hargreave looked at Edmund with the careful assessment of a man checking to see whether his surprise had landed. "I trust this doesn't present a difficulty, Fairchild." Edmund reached into the leather case he had brought and placed 3 documents on the table. He placed them with the same deliberateness that Hargreave had used, no hurry, no drama. The controlled pace of a man who knows that what he is putting down does not require theatrical assistance. "The 1843 survey was politically compromised at commission," Edmund replied. "The survey commissioner had a financial relationship with your grandfather's estate that produced a boundary notation benefiting the Hargreave landholding at the expense of the historical record. This was identified in archival research conducted at Hartwell over the past 5 months. He pushed the documents toward the center of the table. The formal record of the original boundary, established 40 years prior to the 1843 commission, places the drainage channel entirely within Hartwell's boundary. Your survey has confirmed the discrepancy. It has not resolved it in the direction you anticipated." The room was entirely quiet. Hargreave looked at the documents. He looked at Edmund. The smooth expansiveness of his manner had not disappeared, but it had contracted the specific contraction of a man recalculating. "This research," Hargreave said with the careful precision of someone buying time, "was conducted by your estate manager. It was conducted by the Duchess of Hartwell." Edmund met Hargreave's eyes without deviation. Her Grace identified the boundary discrepancy in the Thornfield lease records and traced it to the 1843 commission. The archival documentation establishing the prior boundary is her work. The legal summary attached to those documents was co-authored by Her Grace and reviewed by the Hartwell solicitor. Ford looked up from the documents with an expression of genuine interest. "The Duchess conducted this research personally." "She did." Edmund's voice was level and certain. "Beginning in October of last year." Ford sat back in his chair and looked at the documents with renewed attention. Not skepticism, but the specific alertness of a man recalibrating the scope of what he was looking at. Hargreave's jaw had set in the particular way of a man who is rearranging his position under pressure and does not want anyone to see the effort it requires. "The prior boundary documentation would need independent verification," he said. "I anticipated that." Edmund produced one more document, the letter from the county archives clerk, that Victoria had requested 3 weeks earlier, verifying the provenance of the original boundary records. She had thought of it before he had. He had told her so, and she had simply moved on to the next item on her list, because that was what she did. Verification has already been established. What followed was 3 hours of negotiation that shifted entirely from the terrain Hargreave had prepared and onto the terrain that Victoria's research had established. Hargreave was not a small man in character. He was territorial and ambitious, but he was not dishonest enough to dispute documentation that the county archives had verified, and he was not foolish enough to try. The consortium terms were renegotiated from the ground up with the corrected boundary as the baseline, and by the time the three men concluded, the cost allocation had been restructured in a way that was equitable rather than advantageous to any single party. Ford shook Edmund's hand at the meeting's end with genuine warmth. "Please convey my compliments to the Duchess," he said. "That is exceptionally thorough work." "I'll tell her," Edmund answered. "She'll appreciate it." He drove back to Hartwell Manor in the late afternoon light with the particular feeling of a man who has executed something well and knows the credit belongs to someone else. It was not an uncomfortable feeling. It was in fact considerably more satisfying than the feeling of taking credit he had not earned, which he understood. Only now was something he had been doing for 2 years without realizing it. Victoria was in the east sitting room when he returned. He came directly. There did not stop in his study, did not change his coat, did not do any of the habitual transitional things a man does when he comes home and is settling back into his domestic life. He went directly to the east sitting room because he had something to tell her and he did not want to wait. She looked up when he came in, and in her eyes was the careful, contained question of a woman who had spent the day trying not to think too specifically about what was happening at Norbury Hall. "Hargreaves' survey confirmed the boundary discrepancy," Edmund said. "The prior record stands. The consortium has been restructured on the corrected terms." Victoria set down her pen. He accepted it. He had no legal basis to dispute it. "Your documentation was complete." He paused. "Ford asked me to convey his compliments specifically. He called it exceptionally thorough work." Something moved across Victoria's face. Not triumph. Nothing as simple as that. Something quieter. Something that had been waiting a long time for a room large enough to exist in. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "And Hargreave shook my hand at the end of the meeting and said nothing about it." A brief pause. "Which is, from a man like Hargreave, a form of acknowledgement." Victoria almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that Edmund could see the shape of it. "I told them," Edmund said, "that the research was yours, specifically and completely, in front of Ford and Hargreave both." The almost smile disappeared, replaced by something stiller and more serious. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had always seen more than he had been ready to have seen, and she said quietly, "How did Hargreave receive that?" "Poorly at first." Edmund sat down in the chair across from her. "Better by the end because he is too intelligent to dispute facts in a room where the facts are documented." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." "Don't thank me for it," Edmund said. "That is the minimum of what was owed." She looked at him sharply, not with anger, but with the particular attention of someone registering a thing precisely. He had not said it to be dramatic. He had said it because it was true. And she heard the difference. The days that followed carried a different quality than anything the preceding months had produced. It was not reconciliation. Edmund was careful not to call it that even privately, because reconciliation implied a return to a prior state, and the prior state was not something worth returning to. What was happening was something newer and less familiar, the tentative construction of something that had not previously existed between them. Victoria did not soften suddenly or entirely. She was not the woman she had been in the first year of their marriage, turning toward him every time he entered a room, organizing her days around the hope of his attention. That woman was gone, and Edmund did not mourn her because he was beginning to understand that what he had found in her place was considerably more valuable. This Victoria, the one who had decided quietly and completely to stop seeking his approval, was sharper and more present and more fully herself than the one who had been accommodating him for 2 years. He found he preferred her. He also found that preference complicated because she was not at present particularly interested in what he preferred. She continued her estate work with the same methodical consistency she had brought to it all year. The Calloway family's situation was stabilizing. The Eastfield drainage repair was complete. The revised crop rotation was in place, and Mr. Calloway had recovered enough to manage light work through the spring. Victoria visited on alternate Tuesdays as she always had, but she mentioned it to Edmund now briefly in the course of their morning conversations, and he asked questions, and the asking of questions was a new thing between them that required maintenance. He asked about Lady Hargreave. He asked about the Thornfield family's response to the lease correction letter they had, replied with a brief dignified gratitude that Victoria had said moved her more than she expected. He asked about the county archive clerk who had been so useful, and whether the man had been properly thanked, and Victoria gave him the particular look of a woman who had already sent a thank you letter before Edmund thought to raise the question. He asked one evening over dinner whether she had ever thought about leaving. It was not a question he had planned. It came from somewhere beneath the planning in the way that the most honest questions always do, and once it was in the room between them, he could not retrieve it. Victoria set down her fork with the careful precision that meant she was deciding how fully to answer. "Yes," she said. Edmund held the answer. He did not rush past it or deflect it. He sat with it the way it deserved. When? January. She met his eyes directly, because she was not a woman who had ever flinched from honesty, even when honesty was not comfortable. After the library conversation, the first one in December. I thought about it seriously. I thought about going to my sister in Kent. I thought about what it would require, and what it would cost, and whether the cost was worth what I would gain. He did not ask what she had decided, because the fact that she was still sitting across from him at the dinner table was the answer. "What stopped you?" he asked instead. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, the thinking quiet, not the managed quiet. "Two things," she finally said. "The first was that leaving felt like proof that I had never mattered enough to fight for, and I was not yet ready to believe that." Edmund sat very still. "And the second," her gray eyes were steady and clear. "You came to the library in February, and you sat across from me, and you listened. Not completely, not well enough. But you listened, and you were honest about the limits of your understanding, and that was—" She paused. "That was more than I had seen in 2 years. It was not enough, but it was something." He thought about that for a long time after dinner. Something was not enough. He understood that, and understanding it produced in him a very specific and useful form of discomfort, the kind that does not permit complacency. The county social season began its spring cycle in April, and with it came the obligations that Victoria had always managed, and Edmund had always attended without thinking much about the labor between the invitation and the evening. I was thinking about it now. He was thinking about it with an attention he had not previously brought to the question of what it meant to exist inside a social world that his wife navigated on his behalf constantly and without acknowledgement. The first significant engagement was a dinner at Lord Ashcroft's estate, the same Alderton who had asked Edmund at the winter ball whether the Duchess was displeased. Edmund had thought about that question more than once in the months since December. He had thought about the ease with which he had answered it, and the certainty he had not been entitled to. At the Ashcroft dinner, Edmund did something he had not done at a social engagement in 2 years of marriage. He stayed beside his wife, not in the obvious performative way of a man making a public statement, but in the quieter, more genuine way of a man who has decided that the person he wants to be talking to is the person he is married to and has acted accordingly. When the guests divided after dinner, the men to the smoking room, the women to the drawing room, as convention dictated. Edmund excused himself from the smoking room after 20 minutes and rejoined the full party in the drawing room, which was unusual enough that Lord Ashcroft raised an eyebrow and said nothing, which in the language of English aristocracy was a statement of considerable weight. Victoria noticed. He could tell she noticed by the fractional change in her expression when he came into the drawing room. Not surprise, not pleasure, but the careful alertness of a woman updating her assessment. He sat beside her. They talked with the Ashcroft guests about the agricultural season, and the county politics, and Lady Ashcroft's ambitious new garden project. Edmund contributed to the conversation as he always did, but he was also listening to Victoria specifically with the full attention. He was finally learning to bring to bearing on the person sitting beside him, rather than the person sitting across the room whose competence he was taking for granted. She was brilliant in a social room. He had always known this in the abstract. He was seeing it now in the particular. The way she managed the temperature of a conversation, drawing out the quiet guests, redirecting the overbearing ones, finding the exact right question to ask the person who needed to be asked something. She did it without appearing to do it, which was the highest form of social skill, and Edmund watched her work with the specific admiration of a man who is only now understanding what he has been living beside for 2 years. On the carriage home, they sat in the dark and the quiet of the road, and Edmund said without preamble, "You are very good at that." Victoria turned to look at him in the dim light. "At what?" "Managing a room. Every time." He looked at her directly. "I have watched you do it for 2 years, and I am only now seeing what it actually takes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the road moved beneath them. "Most people don't notice," she said finally. "I know." He held her gaze. "I was most people." She looked out the carriage window for a moment, and he could not see her face in the dark. When she turned back, her voice was quieter than it had been. "It's not that I needed you to notice. Not the way a person needs applause. A careful pause. It's that when you don't notice when the person who is supposed to be your partner moves through the world as though you are part of the furniture, it begins to make you feel as though you are part of the furniture." Edmund said nothing. He let that stand exactly as she had said it because it deserved to stand. "I stopped trying to be seen," Victoria continued, and her voice had the particular quality of a woman saying something she has thought many times and never spoken. "Because I decided that if I was invisible to the one person who was supposed to see me, then visibility was not something I could afford to need anymore." The carriage moved through the dark country road, and Edmund sat with everything she had just told him, and he did not try to fix it, or defend against it, or diminish it with reassurance. He simply held it. Because that was what she had needed for 2 years, and it was late, and it was insufficient, and it was what he had. "I see you now," he said, not as a promise, not as a declaration, as a plain statement of fact offered with the same precision she had always offered him. "I understand that seeing you now does not undo not seeing you before, but I am telling you because you deserve to be told that I see you." The carriage arrived at Hartwell Manor, and they went inside, and Mrs. Hartley had left the lamps burning in the front hall, and the house was quiet around them. At the foot of the stairs, Victoria stopped. She turned to face him, and in the lamplight, her gray eyes were fully present. Not the managed composure of the preceding months, not the careful distance, but the real and unguarded face of a woman who is deciding in real time how much to trust. "Edmund," she said, "what you said at the consortium meeting telling them the research was mine, standing beside that in front of Hargreave, what you said tonight in the carriage." Her voice was very steady. "These are not small things." "No," he agreed. "They are not. But they are also not 2 years." She held his gaze without flinching, without anger, without anything except the clear and complete truth of what she was saying. "I have spent 2 years learning how to not need you. That does not—" She stopped, gathered something, continued. "That does not dissolve in a month because you have decided to look." Edmund received it the way it was intended, not as a door closing, but as the precise and honest terms of a road that was longer than he had, perhaps in his more optimistic moments, been allowing himself to believe. "I know," he said. "I am not saying it is impossible." Her chin came up slightly, and in that gesture was everything that had not died in 2 years of not being seen. The dignity, the persistence, the particular courage of a woman who had continued showing up for things that had not shown up for her. "I am saying it requires more than words, and more than 1 month. Tell me what it requires." The request was direct and completely sincere. "Tell me specifically. I am not asking you to make it easy. I am asking you to tell me what you need, because I have spent 2 years assuming I knew and I was wrong, and I would rather be told plainly than guess incorrectly for another 2 years." Something shifted in the space between them. Not resolution, not repair, but a genuine opening. the first one that had not been managed or maintained by only one of them. "I need you to ask," Victoria said. "Not tell. Ask. I need you to treat my work on this estate as work with the same professional respect you give to Ridley, or your solicitor, or anyone else whose contributions you actually see." A pause. "I need you to be present when you are in this house, not performing presence actually present. There is a difference, and I can tell the difference. I know you can, and I need time." The last one landed quietly without apology. "I cannot offer you what I offered 2 years ago. I cannot go back to being the woman who watched the door every time she heard your step in the corridor. That woman learned what happens when she does that, and she is not going to unlearn it in a month, regardless of how honest the month has been." Edmund looked at his wife, at the woman who had spent 2 years building something remarkable inside a marriage that had not made room for it, who had fought for her own dignity, not through confrontation, but through the harder and less recognized method of continuing to be excellent in the absence of anyone telling her it mattered. "I am not asking you to go back," he said. "I would not go back either. What we had before was not—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "It was not a partnership. I would like a partnership. Whatever that requires from me, and whatever time it requires, I am asking you to tell me so that I can provide it." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. The house was quiet around them. The lamps burned steadily. Outside, the March night pressed against the windows, and inside the front hall of Hartwell Manor. 2 people stood at the foot of a staircase and looked at each other with the particular careful attention of individuals who are deciding with full awareness of the cost whether to believe in something. "I belonged beside you," Victoria said quietly. "I never belonged beneath you, and the difference between those two things is what has been missing." Edmund did not answer immediately, because what she had said required the respect of being fully received before being responded to. He let it stand. He let it fill the room exactly as she had meant it to. "Yes," he said at last. "You're right. And that is my failure to correct, not yours to accommodate." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "Good night, Edmund." And she walked up the stairs with the quiet, self-possessed dignity that had always been hers, and that he had never until December recognized as the extraordinary thing it was. He stood at the foot of the stairs until her step had faded down the upper corridor. Then he went to his study, not to work, but to sit. To sit with what had just happened between them, and to be honest with himself about it. He had asked her what she needed. She had told him. She had told him with the same precision and courage she brought to everything, and none of what she asked was unreasonable, and all of it was owed. The asking would be required daily consistently, without the expectation of immediate return. The recognition of her work would need to become a permanent feature of how he operated, not a gesture made in moments of illumination and forgotten in the ordinary days that followed. I was not certain he could do it perfectly. He was not going to promise perfection, because she was too intelligent to trust a promise of perfection, and he was finally too honest to offer one. But he was going to try in the specific, concrete, daily way that trying actually meant not declaration, but action. Not grand gestures, but the accumulation of small, consistent ones that told a person over time that they were seen. He sat in his study in the quiet house, and he thought about a woman standing at the winter ball in December, turning away from a door she had stopped expecting to open. He thought about what it had cost her to stop turning. I thought about what it would cost him to deserve being turned toward again. The number when he arrived at it was considerable, but it was not, he decided in the quiet of that March night, a debt he was unwilling to pay. He did not sleep well that night. Edmund lay in the dark of his bedroom and stared at the ceiling with the particular wakefulness of a man whose mind has been handed something too significant to process into rest. Victoria's words moved through him in the quiet, not as accusation, not as wound, but as the clean, precise truth of a woman who had finally said the thing she had been carrying for 2 years, and who had said it without asking him to carry it for her. That was the part that stayed with him longest. She had not delivered her truth as a burden for him to bear. She had delivered it as information. As the terms of a road she was willing to walk if he was willing to walk it correctly. I belonged beside you. I never belonged beneath you. He had heard those words, and he had received them, and he was not going to let them become the kind of thing a man hears in an important moment, and then gradually, through the natural erosion of ordinary days, allows to become abstract. He got up before dawn and went to his study and wrote 3 things down on paper. Not promises. He had decided somewhere in the dark hours of that March night that promises were the wrong currency for what this required. What he wrote were intentions stated as practices, specific, daily observable practices. He wrote them not for Victoria to read, but for himself, because he was honest enough now to know that good intentions without structure were simply wishes, and wishes had never built anything worth having. Ask before deciding. Acknowledge before moving on. Be present, not performing presence. 3 lines. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket, where Lady Hargreaves' letter had been 2 months ago, and he went down to breakfast. Victoria was already at the table. She looked up when he came in. Not the watchful, hopeful glance of the woman she had been in the first year of their marriage, but something different, something more considered. The look of a woman who is monitoring something with the careful attention of a person who has been burned before and intends to be intelligent about fire going forward. Edmund sat down. He poured his own coffee, a small thing, a nothing thing, and said, "I've been thinking about the East parcel crop rotation. Ridley's revised schedule starts in April. I'd like you to be at that meeting as well." Victoria studied him for a moment. "You don't need me at every estate meeting." "I know." He met her eyes directly. "I want you at the meetings where your knowledge is relevant and your judgment is useful. This one qualifies on both counts." She considered that. "All right." It was the same answer she had been giving him since February, but the quality of it was different. Not cautious exactly. More like the answer of a woman who is beginning incrementally to believe that the questions being asked of her are genuine. April arrived, and the estate moved into the busy rhythm of spring. The drainage repairs on the east field had transformed the Callaway parcel's prospects in ways that Edmund could now read in the actual numbers, rather than in Victoria's reports of them, yields projected at significantly above the previous 3 years' average. The Callaway family's situation, stabilizing with the kind of concrete security that made real difference in a tenant family's life. Edmund went with Victoria on one of her alternate Tuesday visits to the Callaway farm. He had not announced his intention to come. He had simply been ready when she was, and she had looked at him with the specific expression of a woman recalculating, and she had said, "Come then," and they had gone together. Mrs. Callaway was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 50, who had clearly heard enough about the Duke of Hartwell to have formed opinions about him, and who was sufficiently direct to let those opinions be visible in the first 5 minutes of conversation. She thanked Edmund for the drainage repair with the precise warmth of someone who is grateful for a practical thing and has not decided yet whether to be grateful for the person who provided it. Then she turned to Victoria with the easy warmth of a woman speaking to someone who had been present in her kitchen on difficult mornings, and she said, "Her Grace has been very good to us this winter. Your Grace," with the particular emphasis of a woman making sure the man in the room understood something he might have missed. Edmund looked at his wife. Victoria was looking at Mrs. Callaway with the focused, warm attention she gave to people she had decided mattered, not the social warmth of a duchess performing benevolence, but the genuine interest of a woman who had made it her business to know whether this family was all right and had not stopped making it her business when things became complicated. "She has," Edmund said. "I am aware of that." Mrs. Callaway's eyes moved to him with the quick, assessing intelligence of a woman who had been reading men her entire life and had developed accurate instincts. Whatever she read in his face appeared to satisfy something, because she nodded once briefly and moved to put the kettle on. On the walk back to the manor, Edmund and Victoria moved side by side along the lane between the east field and the home farm, and the spring air was sharp and clean around them, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence they had shared in the entire course of their marriage. "She didn't entirely trust me at first," Victoria said. "Mrs. Callaway." "I noticed." Edmund looked at her. "What changed it?" "I came back." The answer was simple and complete. "I came the first Tuesday, and the second Tuesday, and the third." And eventually she understood that I was not making a charitable visit. I was coming because I wanted to know how they were. A brief pause. People can tell the difference. Edmund walked beside her and thought about the difference between going once and coming back. He thought about how much of his own life had been organized around single decisive actions. The deal closed, the arrangement made the thing decided, and how little of it had been organized around the quieter discipline of returning. Of showing up again after the first time, not because the first time had been insufficient, but because some things require more than one visit to become real. "I understand," he said. Victoria glanced at him sideways. "Do you?" "I'm beginning to." He held her gaze. "I have the disadvantage of being a man who is trained to solve things once and move on. I am learning that some things require a different approach." She was quiet for a moment. Then, without drama, without announcement, "You came today." "Yes." "You didn't have to." "No." He looked ahead at the lane and the greening fields on either side of it. "That's rather the point." The second week of April brought a development that Edmund had not anticipated, and that would, in the weeks to come, force a reckoning far more public than anything the library or the dining room or the carriage rides had produced. It arrived in the form of a dinner invitation, not to Edmund, but to Victoria, from Lady Pemberton of Pemberton Hall. Lady Pemberton was one of the most significant social arbiters in the county. A woman in her late 60s, whose approval carried weight in the aristocratic circles that both the Fairchild and Ashford families had always moved in. The invitation was for a small dinner, 12 guests, the intimate kind that Lady Pemberton reserved for people she considered worth investing in, and it was addressed specifically to Victoria. Not to the Duke and Duchess of Hartwell. To the Duchess. Victoria brought the invitation to Edmund without comment and set it on his desk. He read it. He looked up. "She's invited you independently." "Yes." Victoria's voice was neutral, giving him the space to respond before she told him what she thought. "Lady Pemberton doesn't do that." Edmund looked at the invitation again. "In my experience, Lady Pemberton addresses her invitations to titles, not people. Apparently, she has revised her practice." Victoria folded her hands with the contained composure of a woman who was very deliberately not telling him how significant this was because she did not want to be seen wanting it. Edmund set the invitation down. "This is because of the consortium work. Word travels." "Word travels," Victoria agreed. He looked at her. "You should go." "I intended to go." A slight pause. "I wanted you to know about it." And there it was, small, quiet, almost easy to miss. She had wanted him to know. Not because she needed his permission, not because she was seeking his approval, but because she had decided at some level she had not yet fully announced that he was someone worth telling. Edmund recognized the significance of that with the particular acuity of a man who had learned at considerable cost how to pay attention. "Will you tell me about it afterward?" he asked. The corner of her mouth moved the closest thing to a genuine smile he had seen from her in 4 months. "Yes," she said. "I will." Lady Pemberton's dinner was on a Thursday. Edmund spent that Thursday evening in his study, which was the correct place to be, and he did not spend it usefully because his mind kept moving toward Pemberton Hall and the kind of conversation that happened at 12-person dinners hosted by women who had decided a person was worth investing in. He thought about Victoria moving through that room, the quiet, precise social competence that he had watched at Ashcroft's dinner and still could not quite stop marveling at. I thought about the fact that Lady Pemberton had addressed the invitation to Victoria specifically, which in the language of their world was a statement of recognition that many people spent their entire lives trying to earn. His wife had earned it by doing the work and being the person she was without anyone telling her it mattered, and it had apparently mattered to people who were paying attention. Victoria came home at 10:30. Edmund heard the carriage on the drive, and without making a decision about it, went to the front hall. Victoria came through the door with the particular brightness of a woman who has had a genuinely good evening. Not the social performance of brightness, but the real kind, the kind that lives in the eyes and in the way a person moves. She saw him in the front hall and stopped for a moment. "You're still up. I wanted to hear about it." The admission was direct and simple, and he offered it without embarrassment because there was nothing to be embarrassed about in being interested in your wife's evening. Victoria's expression did something complicated and brief, and then she said, "Come to the sitting room." and he followed her. She told him about the dinner for 40 minutes. She told him about Lady Pemberton herself, sharp-minded and unsentimental, a woman who had outlasted 3 decades of county social life by having good judgment about people and not wasting her energy on those who didn't reward it. She told him about the 2 other women at the dinner who had heard about the consortium research, apparently. Ford had mentioned it to his wife, who had mentioned it to Lady Pemberton, and the version that had arrived at Pemberton Hall was accurate enough to be recognizable. She told him about the conversation that had developed around it. Not gossip, not flattery, but the specific energized conversation of intelligent people, discovering that a subject is more interesting than they had assumed. Lady Pemberton asked me whether I had always been interested in agricultural land economics, Victoria said. There was something in her voice, not pride because she was too restrained for straightforward pride, but the close cousin of it, the particular feeling of having been asked a question that assumes you have a genuine answer. What did you tell her? I told her that I had become interested in it because I had access to the materials and the problems were interesting, and that I suspected a great deal of important estate work went undocumented because the people doing it lacked the title to make it visible. Edmund looked at his wife. What did she say? She said. Victoria paused, and the pause held something she was deciding whether to share. Then she shared it. She said that she suspected the Duchess of Hartwell was one of the most knowledgeable people on agricultural land law in the county, and that it was a remarkable waste that Hartwell had not established that fact publicly years ago. The room was very quiet. Edmund did not look away from her. She's right. Victoria met his eyes. She also said that she had heard from Sir William Ford that the Duke of Hartwell had been explicit about his wife's role in the consortium research in front of Lord Hargreave. She said, another pause, briefer this time. She said that was the act of a man who understood the difference between a helpmate and a partner. Edmund felt something in his chest that he did not immediately identify because it was not a feeling he had much recent experience with. It was something between gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the acknowledgement and grief for how late it had come, and underneath both of those, something quieter and more important, which was the recognition that the woman sitting across from him had deserved every word of what Lady Pemberton had said for the entire 2 years of their marriage, and had been waiting without knowing whether the wait would end for the world to catch up to what she already was. Victoria. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with the full and undivided attention he had been learning slowly and imperfectly to give. I need to tell you something. She waited. I wasted 2 years. He said it plainly without performing contrition, without the specific self-flagellation that would have made the statement about his own discomfort rather than her experience. I wasted 2 years of your intelligence and your work and your... He stopped, found the right word. Your generosity. You were generous with this marriage and with this estate, and with me personally, and I treated that generosity as the expected minimum of your position. And I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that I cannot make right by saying I was wrong, and I know that. But I am telling you because you deserve to hear it said directly, not implied or gestured at. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Her gray eyes were very bright, and he could see in them the careful, controlled work of a woman who is holding something that is larger than the room and is deciding how much of it to let show. I know, she said quietly. I know you know. Is it enough? The question came from somewhere entirely honest. My knowing, is it enough, or is there something I can actually do? She unclenched her hands from her lap, a movement so small he might have missed it 3 months ago, and she said, keep asking. Keep showing up. Stop treating my judgment as a resource, and start treating it as a point of view that deserves equal weight. Her voice was steady. Stop assuming you know what I need and start asking. That's what you can do. I can do that, Edmund said. You've been doing some of it. She looked at him with the clear, direct honesty she had always offered him. Since February, you have been doing some of it, and it is... She stopped. It is not nothing. I want you to know that it is not nothing. Edmund held that. It was not forgiveness, not the full restoration of trust, not the return of the warmth she had carried in the first year and withdrawn in December. But it was not nothing, and she had told him so, and she was not a woman who said things she did not mean. "I waited 2 years for you to see me," Victoria said. The words were quiet and entirely level, the words of a woman who has survived something and is now speaking from the other side of it. "I am not going to pretend that waiting did not change me. I am not going to pretend I am still the woman who would have been grateful for this conversation in January of last year. I don't want that woman," Edmund said. "With respect to her, I don't want her back. I want you, the person you are now, the person you had to become because I was not paying attention." Something in Victoria's face shifted, not dramatically, not with the visible emotional release of a woman who has been waiting for permission to feel something, but genuinely in the specific way of a person hearing something they had stopped expecting to hear and finding that it lands differently than they thought it would. "That's the first time," she said almost to herself. "First time for what?" "The first time you have told me what you want." Her eyes came up to meet his. "In 2 years you have never once told me what you want from this marriage, what you want from me, not in those words." Edmund sat with that. She was right. He had assumed, had decided, had managed, but he had never asked, and he had never told. He had operated the entire length of their marriage as though vulnerability in the domestic sphere was a thing he could afford to skip, because the professional sphere demanded enough of it already, and there was only so much a man could spare. He had been wrong about that too. He had been comprehensively, consistently wrong about the things that mattered most. "I want a partner," he said. "I want someone who tells me when I am wrong and who expects to be heard when she does, and who I can walk into a library at 10 in the morning to find working on something I didn't know needed working on, and feel, rather than inadequacy, actual gratitude that she is there." He held her gaze through all of it. "I want the person you already are. I am asking whether you are willing to offer that to someone who did not earn it early enough." The silence that followed was not managed or performed. It was the real thing, the silence of two people at a genuinely open moment, where the road ahead had not yet been determined, and both of them knew it. Victoria rose from her chair and moved to stand by the window. She stood there for a long moment with her back to him, and Edmund did not rush her because he understood now that rushing her was precisely the wrong thing, and that understanding had been purchased at a price he intended not to waste. When she turned around, her expression was something he had not seen before, not the composed neutrality of the past months, not the careful distance, not the managed warmth of the first year. Something older and more genuinely hers. "I spent 2 years trying to earn a place beside you," she said. "I am not willing to spend the next 2 years doing the same thing. If I stay in this marriage, if I choose to rebuild it with you, I need it to be a different thing than it was. Yes." No hesitation. Not a duke and his duchess. She met his eyes. Two people who are in this together with equal say and equal recognition and equal standing in every room we enter and every decision we make. "That is what I am asking you for," Edmund said. "Not permission to do less, but the opportunity to do more, correctly." Victoria looked at him for a long time. The house held its breath around them, or perhaps that was only Edmund holding his with the particular stillness of a man who has said everything honest he has, and is waiting to learn whether honesty offered this late can still be enough. "All right," Victoria said. 2 words. Quiet, direct, completely hers. "All right," she said again. And this time, there was something in the repetition that was not mere agreement. It was decision. The decision of a woman who has considered carefully and chosen deliberately, which was the only kind of choosing Victoria Ashford Fairchild had ever been capable of. Edmund released the breath he had been holding. He did not move toward her. He understood with the new and hard-won intelligence of a man who has learned what rushing costs, that the distance between them would close on her timeline, not his. He simply looked at her, and she looked at him, and what passed between them in that moment was something that neither of them had the words for, and neither of them needed to name. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. They were better than a fairy tale because they were real, Edmund asked before deciding. Every time, not perfectly, not without the occasional slide back into old habit, but consistently enough that Victoria learned to trust the consistency, which was the only way trust of that kind could be rebuilt. He brought estate matters to her, formally using the word formally advisedly, because what Victoria had always done informally deserved formal recognition, and giving it formal recognition was the most concrete thing he could do to demonstrate that he understood the difference. He introduced her to his solicitor, not as his wife, but as his partner in estate management, and the solicitor, a practical man who had quietly noticed over years of working with the Hartwell estate that certain things ran better than they should have given Edmund's attention to them, simply said, "Of course, Your Grace," and adjusted his correspondence accordingly. He began attending the alternate Tuesday visits to the Calloway farm, as a matter of course. Not every time Victoria's relationship with Mrs. Calloway was her own, and he was not going to colonize it, but often enough that Mr. Calloway, recovering steadily through the spring, began greeting him with the straightforward warmth of a man who has received real help from a real person and knows it. Victoria, for her part, did not transform overnight, and she did not pretend to. She watched. She assessed. She allowed incrementally, and without announcement, the careful rebuilding of something that had been carefully dismantled. She began consulting him before she finalized estate decisions, rather than after, not because she needed his authority, but because she had decided he was worth consulting. She mentioned things over dinner. She brought him letters. She argued with him twice directly, and without managing her tone, about matters of estate policy, where she believed he was wrong. She was right both times. The first argument was about the Thornfield lease extension terms, and Victoria held her ground against Edmund's initial position with the focused, evidence-based persistence of a woman who knew her material and was not going to let social deference substitute for correct thinking. Edmund conceded the point after 20 minutes. He conceded it because she was right, and he had stopped valuing his own certainty over someone else's correctness. The second argument was about the autumn social schedule, a cluster of county obligations that Edmund had committed to without consulting her, which produced in Victoria a brief pointed silence, followed by the clearest statement of expectation she had yet delivered. "I need you to consult me before committing this household to engagements," she said. "My time is not a resource you manage on my behalf. It is mine to allocate." Edmund looked at her. "You're right. I apologize. I'll withdraw the commitments that conflict and send the regrets." Victoria blinked. She had been prepared for more resistance, and the absence of it required a moment of recalibration. "Thank you," she said, with the careful precision of a woman still learning that some things can be asked for and received without a fight. "You don't have to thank me for that either," Edmund said. "That is also the minimum." She looked at him for a moment, with the gray eyes that had always been honest and were becoming slowly, and without drama, something warmer. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She said nothing. But something in her expression for the first time in months was not careful. By May, Victoria was laughing at dinner again. Not the social laugh, the real one. The one Edmund had heard only a handful of times in 2 years of marriage. The one that happened when something genuinely surprised her into amusement. It happened over a letter from Lady Hargreave, who had written with the characteristic dry precision of a woman who had been right about things for 60 years and was mildly amused to continue being right. The letter described Lord Hargreave's revised position on the consortium, gracious now in public. Privately, according to Lady Hargreave, absolutely furious with the contained satisfaction of a woman who has watched justice operate and found it competent. Victoria read the relevant passage aloud at dinner, and then she laughed, and it was the real thing, and Edmund listened to it and felt something in his chest that he identified with the honesty he had been practicing as very close to joy. "Lady Hargreave is remarkable," Victoria said. "She is." Edmund watched his wife across the dinner table. "She trusted you with information that required trust. That says something about the person you presented to her." Victoria looked at him. "It says something about her as well. She didn't have to warn us." "No." He held her gaze. "She chose to, because you gave her a reason to." The summer ball at Hartwell Manor was held in the second week of June. Edmund stood in the drawing room as the guests arrived, and he watched his wife move through the room with the quiet, confident grace of a woman who had made peace with her own competence and no longer needed the room to confirm it for her. She was wearing a gown the color of deep sea water, and she moved through the gathering without performing grace, simply inhabiting it. And the people around her responded the way people always respond to someone fully present in themselves. Lady Pemberton was among the guests. She crossed the room to Victoria within 10 minutes of arriving and drew her into a conversation that lasted 20, and Edmund, watching from across the room with the unguarded attention of a man who had finally stopped pretending he had better things to look at, watched his wife hold her own in that conversation with the ease of a person who has stopped apologizing for knowing things. Midway through the evening, Victoria looked up from across the room. She looked directly at him. Not the searching, hopeful look of the first year. Not the careful, managed neutrality of December through February. Something else entirely, the direct, level look of a woman who has decided where she stands and is looking at the person she has decided to stand beside. Edmund looked back. He held her gaze across the candlelit room full of 60 people, and what passed between them in that moment was not performance, and was not management, and was not the careful negotiation of two people who have decided to tolerate each other's company. It was recognition. Complete, unhurried, mutual. Victoria almost smiled, the real one, the one that happened without warning. Then Lord Ashcroft appeared at her elbow and claimed her attention, and she turned away, and Edmund stood where he was and thought about the specific quality of that look. I thought about what it had cost her to look at him like that. Not the old look, the hopeful, searching one that he had wasted for 2 years. This new one, the one that said, "I have chosen to be here. I am not here out of hope or habit or expectation. I am here because I have decided." That look had cost her something real, and she had offered it to him anyway. Later that evening, when the guests were at their liveliest and the music had started in the East Room, Edmund crossed to where his wife was standing and offered her his arm. Victoria looked at him. She looked at the offered arm. Then she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow with the settled, deliberate certainty of a woman who has made her choice and is not uncertain about it. "You're going to dance with me," Edmund said. "I'm going to dance with you," Victoria confirmed. They moved to the East Room together, and they danced, not perfectly, because Edmund was a competent dancer rather than a natural one, and Victoria knew it and did not pretend otherwise. But they danced with the ease of two people who have stopped performing for each other and have begun at long last simply to be present. When the music paused, Victoria looked up at him with the gray eyes that had always been honest and were now also unmistakably warm. "I waited 2 years for you to see me," she said quietly, for his hearing alone. "Now you must learn to keep seeing me, not because you are afraid of losing me, but because you want to." Edmund looked at his wife, at the woman who had rebuilt herself inside a marriage that had not made room for her, who had chosen in the clear-eyed way of someone who understood the cost of choosing to remain and to require better. And he said, with the complete and particular honesty that he had been learning slowly and at considerable cost, to offer, "I already want to. That is not the difficulty." "What is the difficulty?" "The difficulty," Edmund said, "is making sure that every ordinary day makes that as plain as this one does." Victoria held his gaze. "Then that is what we do," she said. "Every day." "Every day," he agreed. And they were not what they had been. They would never be what they had been. The arrangement and the acceptance and the long-managed silence of two people living beside each other without truly meeting. That version of their marriage was finished as completely as the December frost that had hardened the East Field, and the woman who had stopped looking at the door. What they built in its place was harder and slower and less comfortable than the thing it replaced, because it was real. It required both of them every day in equal measure, the asking and the answering, the seeing and the willingness to be seen. The discipline of presence in the ordinary hours that do not announce themselves as significant, but are in fact the only hours that matter. Edmund Fairchild learned in the second year of his marriage what the first year had cost him, the opportunity to learn at the right time that the greatest strength he possessed was not his land, or his title, or his political acumen, or his ability to rebuild a failing enterprise through force of will. The greatest strength he possessed was standing beside him in a deep blue gown, telling him the truth without softening it, offering him a partnership he had not earned early enough but had been given the chance to earn now. And Victoria Fairchild, who had spent 2 years learning to not need learning, to not watch learning, to build a life inside herself that did not depend on a closed door. Ever opening discovered something she had not expected to discover. Not that she had been wrong to stop looking. She had not been wrong. But that stopping had not been the end. It had been in the way of the most important things a beginning. She had stopped seeking his approval. And in doing so, she had finally, without intending it, without asking for it, become the woman he could not afford to lose. That was not a small thing. It was not she understood now the thing she had been waiting for. It was better. It was the thing she had built for herself in the long and unwitnessed months when no one was watching. And the fact that he had finally seen it did not make it his. It was hers. It had always been hers. And she intended to keep it that way. Joel. End of part 5, end of story.